Indochina is a region in Southeast Asia that encompasses Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos. The French gradually colonized the region from 1887 till 1907 and remained its undisputed ruler for decades. However, its swift defeat during World War II and the Japanese occupation caused independent movements to grow in popularity. One of them was the League for the Independence of Vietnam, better known as Viet Minh, which was founded in 1941 by Nguyen Ai Quoc, who would later change his name to Ho Chi Minh. Quoc was an enthusiastic supporter of Marxism and had just finished his political studies in the communist universities of Moscow and China. His connections would more than once support his efforts generously. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Second World War officially ended. During the July 1945 Potsdam Conference in Germany, France was eager to re-establish its former colonies, but remained incapable due to the year-long occupation. Therefore, Indochina was divided. China would receive the Japanese surrender until the 16th parallel, and a Franco-British force would take the south. Following the surrender of Japan, the Viet Minh declared the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The Chinese Republican Army that marched into North Vietnam despised the Viet Minh but was convinced to cooperate. Meanwhile, in October 1945, a Franco-British expedition force landed in the south and defeated the Viet Minh in a 6-month-long campaign. In the north, the Chinese withdrew only after the French renounced all their concessions in China. The move was proposed by Ho Chi Minh. In early 1946, French troops landed in Haiphong to begin negotiations with the Viet Minh. On the 23rd of November, fighting broke out between the factions over trivial matters that eventually escalated and led to the bombardment of the Vietnamese part of the city. 6,000 civilians died in a single afternoon. The Haiphong incident marked the beginning of the First Indochina War. As retaliation, the Viet Minh detonated explosives at a power plant close to Hanoi. In the ensuing blackouts, they raided French outposts. It took French troops a total of 60 days to regain control over Hanoi, enough for the Viet Minh to evacuate into the jungle. Throughout the following years, the Viet Minh engaged in asymmetric warfare with great success. As a means to oppose the Viet Minh politically, France created the puppet State of Vietnam, that was granted special rights within the French Union and even participated with its own army. With the triumph of the Chinese Communists in 1949, the Viet Minh gained a political ally at their northern border. Support and reorganization strengthened the Viet Minh and intensified the war even farther. By June 1950, North Vietnam also gained recognition from China and the Soviet Union, while the South was recognized by the US and UK. As the Viet Minh gained support, the French lost control. At first, only remote jungle areas, but then also the northeast of Tonkin. The only exception constituted a series of strongholds along the Chinese border. During the autumn-winter campaign, the fortress of Dong Qui was overrun, which cut vital supply lines to the garrison of Cao Bang. The French decided to evacuate Cao Bang to the south, while the garrison in that key was ordered to retake Dong Qui and keep hold of it until the evacuation was completed. On the 30th of September, an assault from the south was rebuffed. Simultaneously, the forces from the north were under constant fire from continuing ambushes. Eventually, they managed to link up, but were hunted down and completely annihilated. Of over 6,000 soldiers, only 700 managed to reach French lines. As French morale had hit a new low point, a new strategy was adopted. A series of concrete fortifications from Haiphong to Hanoi were built. At the Battle of VinhIen, the Viet Minh were lured into a trap and suffered 8,000 casualties. Every other attempt to break the line was rebuked with similar outcomes. From July 1951 to 1953, French forces were partially successful with counter-operations in the Red River Delta, but also failed to divert enemy supply lines. To escape the stalemate, the Viet Minh marched into Laos, an ally of France in mid-1953. As a countermeasure, Dien Bien Phu was taken through a parachute drop and fortified. The town, while small, lay on a strategically important supply route, deep in the hills of North Vietnam. Now, it would become the location for the decisive battle of the war. The remote location made it easy for the Viet Minh to isolate the garrison from supplies and reinforcements. The only route was knocked out. Anti-aircraft guns and the monsoon season made it hard to sustain a continuous airlift. On the morning of the 13th of March 1954, the Viet Minh shelled the French positions and repeatedly assaulted the garrison. Despite fierce resistance, the French finally lost the fight on the 7th of May. By the end of the war on August 1st, 1954, the Viet Minh had lost 200,000 men. The members of the French Union had lost 75,000, 20,000 of which were French. 65,000 soldiers had been wounded. The state of Vietnam had lost about 60,000, and 500,000 civilians had been killed in the crossfire. After the decisive defeat at Dien Bien Phu, France released their colony back into independence. Laos and Cambodia were granted their former territories, but Vietnam was divided. The communists under Ho Chi Minh were granted North Vietnam. As an alternative for Catholics and anti-communists, the South became the Republic of Vietnam. Across the emerging nations, various groups fought for political control. The new configuration would not remain peaceful for long. As one war ended, the next was just around the corner. The First Indochina War ended in 1954 with the divide of the former French colony into Cambodia, Laos, and North and South Vietnam. The North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh were especially bitter about the divide of their country. Hence, it was just a question of time until the next conflict. The involvement of the Soviet Union and China on the northern side, along with US aid to the south, turned the battlefield into another proxy war. The Communist North was still tarnished by the First Indochina War. Therefore, large-scale operations were not possible yet. However, this did not prevent the founding and deployment of an armed guerrilla force, the Viet Cong. They would unite the communist resistance and violently undermine the inept and dictatorial government of the South. What started as an uprising gradually escalated into all-out insurgency. About 90,000 Viet Cong infiltrated established liberated zones and challenged the Southern Army. In March 1959, the armed revolution began as Ho Chi Minh declared a people's war to unite all of Vietnam under his leadership, thus starting the Second Indochina War. While the Viet Cong made great advancements in the south, North Vietnam set its eyes on Laos first. The Laotian government was heavily divided until the communist Lao People's Liberation Army, with support from North Vietnam, started a civil war and occupied the eastern side of Laos. The US and South Vietnam would also expand their influence into that area and train Thai mercenaries, Hmong rebels, and governmental forces. The Laotian Panhandle was a vital area for the Viet Cong in the south. The construction of the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of streets and tunnels throughout the dense jungle, would deliver supplies to forces in the south. Estimates state that between 20 and up to 234 tons of supplies were delivered every day, and 3,000 to 9,000 combatants would reach the south every year. An unparalleled military achievement, given it was the site of the single most intense air interdiction campaign in history, with bombs dropping, on average, every 7 minutes. President John F. Kennedy was fully aware of the situation in Indochina, but rather insisted on covert operations and pacification instead of an open confrontation. He even supported the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, the unpopular president of South Vietnam. Without him, they would be better off. However, Kennedy himself was assassinated in 1963. His successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, relied on a pro-war stance. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, which later turned out to be staged, gave him the necessary authority for a full-scale invasion. The invasion started with an intense bombing run across Indochina. The first personnel would arrive in March 1965 and eventually reach 200,000 men. Hanoi anticipated the arrival and recruited nearly 1 million men by 1964. The first major engagement was the Battle of La Drang Valley on November 14, 1965, when helicopters landed over 1,000 men who engaged with 2,500 Vietnamese. Neither side would gain a victory. The US referred to complex search and destroy operations, in which helicopters would shuffle hundreds of men into a landing zone, destroy vital points, and then withdraw. However, the North Vietnamese remained elusive and demonstrated great tactical flexibility. The Tet Offensive was one of the largest military operations carried out by North Vietnam. In the late night hours of January 30th, 1968, a staggering 80,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers stormed over 100 vital towns and cities. The offensive was split into 3 phases and lasted for nearly 8 months. The invasion caught the US and the South forces off guard. While the Allies would eventually regroup and push the North Vietnamese back in mere days, other battlefields would be fought over months. In the battles of Saigon and the town of Hue, 2 months of fierce fighting were necessary before the Viet Cong was driven back. In the Battle of Khe Sanh, which started just 9 days before the Tet Offensive, an encircled base had to hold out for 4 months before a corridor was established and evacuated under the cover of night. The region was lost and broke the McNamara Line that was supposed to prevent infiltration into South Vietnam. By the end of the Tet Offensive, about 168,000 casualties from the initial 600,000 participants were reported on the northern side. The Allies reported about 45,000 casualties from about 1.3 million participants. The leadership in Hanoi was despondent at the outcome of their offensive. The purpose of the wide-scale offensive by the Politburo was to trigger political instability, in the belief that mass armed assault on urban centers would trigger defections and rebellions. But neither of those were achieved, and furthermore, ended in defeat. South Vietnam was in turmoil in the aftermath of the offensive. Tragedy compounded tragedy as the conflict reached into the nation's cities for the first time. As government troops pulled back to defend urban areas, the Viet Cong moved in to fill the vacuum in the countryside. The violence and destruction shook confidence in the government, since the offensive seemed to reveal that even with massive American support, the government could not protect its citizens. However, in the following months, South Vietnam gained even more determination, with general mobilization, anti-corruption campaigns, and demonstration of political unity. In the US, the Tet Offensive turned the already unpopular war into the lowest approval rating. The escalation of the war led to a switch in power. Republican candidate Richard Nixon won the election by claiming to have a secret plan to win the war. Spoiler alert, he did not. Not only was the home front falling apart, but morale was also collapsing amongst US forces. Desertion rate quadrupled since 1966. Among enlisted men, only 2.5% chose combat positions. Reserve officer enrollments decreased from 190,000 to just 32,000 in 1974, depriving the military of much-needed leadership. The situation in Vietnam was even worse. Unit cohesion was falling apart. Entire companies refused orders and showed disobedience. 30% of the GIs frequently used marijuana, and 10 to 15% used high-grade heroin. Those circumstances led to a general withdrawal which marked the beginning of the end. The Kingdom of Cambodia officially declared neutrality. However, they tolerated the North Vietnamese to train allies. The so-called Khmer Rouge was formed as early as 1963 and helped to supply the Viet Cong, which was silently accepted by the king. In 1970, the King of Cambodia was overthrown by his pro-American government, which, in return, sparked violent outrages in Khmer Rouge-controlled areas. The population panicked and targeted the Vietnamese minority. Dozens were rounded up in detention camps and killed. On the 29th of March 1970, the North Vietnamese had taken matters into their own hands and occupied the northeast. The Allies, in return, started a counterstrike a month later. This was one of the most successful campaigns ever carried out. Despite the failure to capture the Vietnamese leadership, large supply depots were destroyed. However, after the withdrawal, the Cambodian forces failed to fill the void, and the Khmer Rouge once again stepped in. In 1972, peace talks began behind closed doors, which resulted in a ceasefire agreement. On January 15, 1973, all US combat activities were suspended, and all of their forces were withdrawn 2 months later. Multiple clashes reignited the war in 1974. Despite better equipment and double the troops, South Vietnam lacked the funds and spare parts to fuel the army. Saigon fell on April 30, 1975, thus ending the Second Indochina War. Including the theaters in Laos and Cambodia, the Northern Allies lost roughly 900,000 soldiers, while 600,000 were wounded. The Southern Allies suffered 400,000 dead and 1.3 million were wounded. Civilian casualties are estimated between 1.3 and 3.4 million. Vietnam was finally reunited after nearly 20 years of combat. But instead of peace and prosperity, the next conflict was just around the corner. For another 16 years, Indochina would not find peace. During the Second Indochina War, the Communists Indochina formed an alliance against South Vietnam and its allies. While the alliance prevailed throughout the war, Cambodia continuously feared an imminent takeover by Vietnam in order to establish an Indochina Federation under Vietnamese leadership. While Cambodia officially declared neutrality during the Vietnam War, North Vietnam still proceeded to establish a base area and sanctuaries in the east of the country. Without this involvement, war efforts in the south would have been much more challenging. Their presence was at first tolerated by Prince Sihanouk of Cambodia, but later the aide to the violent anti-government Khmer Rouge urged him to travel to Moscow and demand the cessation of support. However, efforts took a turn when his government dismissed him during his absence. Following wide-scale protests, the Vietnamese minority was violently targeted in the capital city. On the 15th of April, 800 bodies floated down the Mekong Delta into South Vietnam. The new head of the state, Prime Minister Lon Nol, demanded that the North Vietnamese leave the country. But they refused and promptly invaded the new republic on request of the Khmer Rouge. In return, the Prime Minister asked for United States aid. Prince Sihanouk returned later that year and allied with the Khmer Rouge, which quickly grew from 6,000 to 50,000 men. The government also called on Cambodians for recruitment, and 70,000 rallied to their cause. This issue would no longer be resolved peacefully. The North Vietnamese invasion completely changed the course of the civil war. Lands containing nearly half of the Cambodian population were conquered and handed over to the Khmer Rouge. This resulted in the Cambodian government being greatly weakened and the insurgents increasing in size multifold over the course of a few weeks. On the 29th of April 1970, South Vietnamese and United States units unleashed a limited, multi-pronged Cambodian campaign. Extensive logical installations and large amounts of supplies were found and destroyed. But still larger amounts of military material had already been moved further from the border. Due to the eventual withdrawal, the Khmer Rouge once again seized control of the regions. Despite large financial aid, corrupt officers from the governmental forces withheld payment, food, and even sold supplies to their enemies. This caused a low point in morale and high desertion rates. During Operation Chenla 2, the retake of Kompong Thorm, the Republican forces lost 10 battalions and the initiative for ongoing operations. From that point forward, the war was decided. The Khmer Rouge gradually cut supply lines into the countryside and squeezed Phnom Penh dry day by day until it fell on the 17th of April 1975, thus ending the civil war and starting the Cambodian Genocide, which would result in the killing of roughly 2 million people, about a quarter of the population at the time. Cambodia and Vietnam have a long history of hostilities which never really subsided. The party leadership held strong suspicions that Vietnam would take over their country and form an Indochina Union under Hanoi. With a foreseeable victory in sight, the Khmer Rouge purged their own ranks from Hanoi-trained members as well as those loyal to the king. The leader of the newly formed Democratic Kampuchea, Pol Pot, ordered the invasion of the Vietnamese island of Phu Quoc on the 1st of May 1975, barely 24 hours after the fall of Saigon, claiming it was Cambodian territory. 9 days later, the Tho Chu Islands were occupied and 500 Vietnamese civilians were executed. The counter-offensive immediately drove away the invaders. This was just the beginning of progressively worsening border clashes. Pol Pot kept a borderline relationship with Hanoi. On one side, he invaded territory. On the other side, he flew to Vietnam and proclaimed friendship between the socialist nations. In 1977, Cambodia kept raiding and executing Vietnamese citizens in their territory. Angered by the conflict, Vietnam gathered 60,000 men and retaliated against the invaders. However, at that point, they still had good faith and forced Cambodia to negotiate. After yet another withdrawal, Cambodia invaded again in 1978. This time, the village of Ba Chuk was occupied and massacred. Over 3,000 civilians were killed. Vietnam ran out of patience and carried out a full-scale invasion. After just 2 weeks, Phnom Penh was occupied and Cambodia lost half of its military. The Cambodian government sought refuge in the jungle, while resistance groups formed in the west of the country. China, Cambodia's ally, invaded the northern part of Vietnam with over 200,000 men, forcing the withdrawal in Cambodia. However, their half-hearted efforts proved fruitless as fierce resistance kept them at bay. 3 weeks and 120,000 casualties later, they seized the occupation. As a result of the victory of the Khmer Rouge, over the governmental forces in 1975, the radical communists established a brutal dictatorship across the country. The events that followed would find their way into the history books as one of the most violent genocides to have ever occurred. Born to a prosperous farmer, Pol Pot was educated at one of the elite schools in Cambodia. While staying in Paris in 1940, he joined the French Communist Party. Returning to Cambodia in 1953, he then joined the Khmer Viet Minh, the predecessors to the Khmer Rouge, in the fight against the King of Cambodia. He founded the Communist Party of Kampuchea in 1959, but had to hide in the jungle to avoid state pushback. In 1965, he flew to Beijing to meet officials of the CCP. Later, Beijing supplied his war efforts generously with over $1 billion of funding. It was only in 1968 that Pol Pot eventually relaunched the war alongside Vietnam. With his allies, he overthrew the government and established his rule in 1975. The highest priority of the government was to establish an agricultural society. Their goal was to achieve 70% to 80% farm mechanization within 5 to 10 years, and a modern industrial base within 15 to 20 years. As part of this project, Pol Pot saw it as imperative that they develop means of ensuring that the farming population worked harder than ever before. At the September plenum, Pol Pot announced that all farmers were now expected to meet a quota of 3 tons of paddy, or unmilled rice, per hectare, an increase on what was previously the expected yield. Although a new Cambodian currency had been printed in China during the Civil War, the Khmer Rouge decided not to introduce it. They believed that the new currency would only lead to corruption and undermine their efforts to establish a socialist society. Thus, for a time, there were no wages in democratic Kampuchea. The population was expected to do whatever the Khmer Rouge commanded of them without pay. If they refused, they faced punishment, sometimes even execution. For this reason, Pol Pot's Cambodia was seen as a slave state, with its people effectively forced into slavery by working without pay. The new standing committee decreed that the population would work 10-day weeks with 1 day off. From 1975 on, all those living in rural areas, meaning the vast majority of Cambodia's population, were reclassified as members of one of 3 groups: full rights members, candidates, or the depositees, the lowest class which held basically no rights. The Khmer Rouge militia regularly killed those they deemed to be bad elements. A common proclamation utilized by the Khmer Rouge for those to be executed was that to keep you is no profit, to destroy you is no loss. Bodies were often buried by fields in order to act as fertilizer. During the first year under Khmer Rouge rule, most areas around the country were able to stave off starvation despite significant population increases caused by the deposited cities being evacuated. Measures were taken to indoctrinate those living in the cooperatives with common phrases about hard work and loving Cambodia. Cambodians were encouraged to talk about themselves in the plural we, rather than the singular I. While working the fields, people were typically segregated by sex. Sport was prohibited. The only reading material that people were permitted to read was produced by the government. Restrictions were placed on movement, with people allowed to travel only with the permission of the local authorities. The Constitution asserted state ownership by the means of production, declared the equality of men and women, and the right and obligation of all citizens to work. Pol Pot described the new state as a precious model for humanity, with a revolutionary spirit that outstripped that of earlier revolutionary socialist movements. Despite their Marxist pretenses, the Khmer Rouge sought to eradicate the working class, viewing it as a decadent relic of the past. Several villages were linked to form a single cooperative of between 500 to 1,000 families. Communal kitchens were also introduced, so that all members of a commune ate together rather than in their homes. Foraging or hunting for additional food was prohibited. Starting in the summer of 1976, the government ordered that any child over the age of 7 would not live with their parents, but instead communally with Khmer Rouge instructors. The Khmer Rouge also classified people based on their religious and ethnic backgrounds. Under the leadership of Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge had a policy of state atheism. Buddhist monks were viewed as social parasites and designated a special class. The killing fields are a number of sites in Cambodia where, collectively, more than 1 million people were killed and buried. Analysis of 20,000 mass grave sites indicates at least 1,386,734 victims of execution. Estimates of the total death toll resulting from Khmer Rouge policies, including death from disease and starvation, range from 1.7 to 2.5 million, out of a population of roughly 8 million in 1975. The Khmer Rouge regime arrested and eventually executed almost everyone suspected of having connections with the former Cambodian government or with foreign governments as well as professionals and intellectuals. Ethnic Vietnamese, ethnic Thai, ethnic Chinese, ethnic Cham, Cambodian Christians, and Buddhist monks were additional demographic targets of persecution. The judicial process of the Khmer Rouge regime for minor or political crimes began with a warning from the regime. People who had received more than 2 warnings were sent for re-education, which meant near certain death. People were often encouraged to confess their pre-revolutionary lifestyles in crimes, implying free market activity or contact with foreigners. These individuals were then taken away for torture or execution. To save ammunition, executions were often carried out using poison, spades, sharpened bamboo sticks, bayonets, knives, wooden clubs, hoes for farming, and curved scythes. In some cases, the children and infants of adult victims were killed by having their heads bashed against the trunks of chankiri trees before being thrown into the pits alongside their parents. The rationale was to stop them growing up and taking revenge for their parents' deaths. In September 1976, various party members were arrested and accused of conspiring with Vietnam to overthrow Pol Pot's government. These party members were accused of being spies for either the CIA, the Soviet KGB, or the Vietnamese. They were encouraged to confess to the accusations, often after torture, with these confessions then being read out at party meetings. The Khmer Rouge converted a disused secondary school in Phnom Penh's Tuol Sleng region into a security prison, S21. By the spring of 1977, 1,000 people were being sent there month after month. Eventually, between 15,000 and 20,000 people would be killed at S21. Across the country, peasant cadres tortured and killed members of their communities whom they disliked. Many cadres ate the livers of their victims and tore unborn fetuses from their mothers for use as Kun-Krak talismans. By August 1977, between 4,000 and 5,000 party members had been neutralized. In 1978, the government initiated a second purge, during which tens of thousands of Cambodians were accused of being Vietnamese sympathizers and murdered. Renewed border clashes between Vietnam and Cambodia reappeared in 1977. The failure of the Eastern Zone to withstand the initial Vietnamese invasion made Pol Pot suspicious, and he ordered a purge of their ranks. Aware that they would be killed on Pol Pot's orders, increasing numbers of Eastern Zone troops began rebelling against the Khmer Rouge government. Pol Pot sent more troops into the eastern zone to defeat the rebels, ordering them to slaughter the inhabitants of any villages that were believed to be harboring rebel forces. Fleeing the government troops, many leading rebels, including future high-ranking politicians, made it into Vietnam, where they joined the anti-Pol Pot exile community. On the 25th of December 1978, the Vietnamese army launched its full-scale invasion. Within just 2 weeks, Phnom Penh was captured. The remaining party members, including Pol Pot, fled into the jungle where they regrouped and adapted guerrilla warfare for almost the next 2 decades. Attempts to regain political power failed due to general unpopularity, clashes, and infighting. Pol Pot's health was also declining. He suffered from aortic stenosis and no longer had access to follow-up treatment for his earlier cancer. A stroke left him paralyzed on the left side of his body. The division among the Khmer eventually caused a comrade to imprison him for betrayal. On the 15th of April 1998, Pol Pot died of heart failure in his sleep. The Khmer Rouge themselves continued to face territorial losses to the Cambodian army, and, in March 1999, the last high-ranking member was also captured, thus closing this dark chapter of Cambodian history. Despite clashes with insurgents, the country slowly recovered from decades of war. In 1989, after 10 years, Vietnam left the country, which was now subject to a much-needed international peacekeeping mission. It was only in 1998 that the Khmer Rouge dissolved completely. Border clashes with insurgents still occurred until 1991, when the Paris Peace Accords were signed, thus ending the Third Indochina War, a conflict that had lasted an additional 16 years. About 50,000 Vietnamese soldiers lost their life. On the Cambodian side, 15,000 became victims of war. 230,000 civilians shared the same fate. By the end of the Third Indochina War, 45 years had passed, from 1946 to 1991. During this time period, it's estimated that up to 4.4 million people died due to combat-related activities. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Vietnam established diplomatic relationships with the United States and opened up to the world. Its economy grew from $14 billion in 1985 to $245 billion 35 years later. The average income grew from $231 to $2,451, with an upward trend. Laos and Cambodia have similar stories, with an average growth of 8% per year. After all that the people have been through, it is well deserved.